Perspective is a funny thing, especially when we talk about future time perspective. The future time perspective is about looking into the future. But it's not just about looking into the future. It's about being in the future and being able to look back. There's a funny thing that when you talk about regret is different than any other sad emotion, like shame or guilt. Shame is when something outside of you makes you feel bad. Guilt is when you know there's a part of you that's responsible. I've always thought the way to live life was to make mistakes and to have no regrets. And regret is looking forward by looking back at what you didn't do. When I was a little boy, I had a class, and in that class, I was asked to write a story. And that story was about the conquistadors or the pilgrims coming to America. And what did it feel like? It was for the 3rd grade. Well, I wrote a story. And my story was about a little mouse inside a big ship, and what was happening and how that mouse tried to survive the storms, the rough seas, the sick people on the boat. Well, my teacher read it, of course, and called in my mom. And in front of my mom, I heard the teacher say, all of my students wrote about sailors, captains of the ship, pilgrims and their families, but your boy wrote about a little mouse hiding. That's an interesting perspective, she thought. Is there anything going on? And it turns out that my mother said no. No, my boy's just very creative. What the teacher never figured out was something that the police never really were too concerned with. And that was, through some flip of genetic fate, myself and my sisters don't bruise easily. My parents were divorced. My mother and father were alcoholics. And so we did what we had to do to survive. And it wouldn't be unusual for the police to show up from all the screaming and yelling, our mother chasing us, hitting, slapping, knocking us down, me trying to get in front, getting pushed. But when the police came, the bruises weren't there. When you think about the way someone tells a story and it's fragmented, you sometimes don't realize how that fragmented part of that story really is something special, but that is just part of many fragments that make up who you are. And so that boy who was bored and challenged at school, who would cry and no one understood why, eventually journeyed through life and was able to have a very interesting time finding out where all those fragments need to go and be, from taking on jobs as hosts of comedy clubs, working in boiler rooms, selling office supplies, developing software, selling it to broadcasters, going on tours, training hundreds of account executives, waiting tables, being a dive bar host, studying, going to universities and getting not one but 2 masters and a doctorate, all in trying to figure out where the allies were. Where were the people who were going to help? And I don't think that's where the journey really ends. It's just where that journey continues. And you get to a point where you figure out that those objects that you think are just meaningless artifacts from your childhood, you start to see that all those pieces from all the weird, fragmented jobs, roles, characters, personas that we all put on, whether we're at work, in a relationship, whether we're looking at our own storytelling that we tell ourselves of what we think is the meaning of what we're doing. And what we realize is that these objects have meaning. And so that mouse isn't just a story in a third grade homework assignment. It's an object that sits on my shelf that when my mother died, we had to go back and go through all of that artifacts, material, objects. And despite all the pain and unresolved emotions in looking at what was that childhood that we survived, and going back 35 years after those horrific events of trying to dodge punches and pushes, there was that toy. There were those objects that had been saved, even though we hadn't lived in that house for decades. What did that mean? That there were objects that represented stories that were unresolved and that had all these obstacles built into them. On looking at it and in trying to piece it together, I realized that the work that I do every day is to help others not try to force meaning into any of those pieces, but instead try to transform those fragments into values. And that's really the transformation. And the battle is we try so hard to find meaning in all the things that we do. But really, it's holding on to those values. Is there a meaning to a little boy that writes a story about a mouse in a big ship during a storm? Or is there just value to the creativity of that little boy? And so now, as I'm grown and I teach and I coach, I figure out ways that I can help others find value in all those little pieces. And sometimes it just appears. There's an object, there's an activity, there's a hobby, and we hold back and we try to stay away from or compartmentalize. And I say this to a lot of my friends and clients. I say, self-actualization is not knowing every fragment or every part of your personality. Self-actualization is using all those parts. Using the salesperson in the boiler room. Using the dive bar host. Using the writer who wrote stories. Using the person who trained hundreds and hundreds of people in large corporations. All of it, wow, could easily be seen as a meaning of just another person who survived an abusive, alcoholic childhood. Or all those twists, turns were really just pieces of value I learned to embrace.